Are there any good arguments for the existence of God? Well, not from where I'm standing, but let's check out another 10 and see where all of these things go ridiculously wrong. Welcome back to more bad arguments for the existence of God, a comprehensive look, at least as comprehensive as I can manage, at many of the really terrible arguments that the religious come up with to rationalize their imaginary friend in the sky. As we saw in the first set, these just don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny, but some of these are so unbelievably terrible that we just have to take a look at them, if for no other reason than to point and laugh. So here go another 10. Sorry to make you suffer. Let's get started. The argument from answered prayers. Premise 1. Sometimes people pray to God for good fortune, and against enormous odds, their calls are answered. For example, a parent prays for the life of their dying child, and the child recovers. Premise 2. The odds of the beneficial event happening are enormously slim, from 1. Premise 3. The odds that the prayer would have been followed by recovery out of sheer chance are extremely small, from 2. Premise 4. The prayer could only have been followed by the recovery if God listened to it and made it come true. Conclusion: God exists. Alright, unfortunately for the religious, nothing fails as miserably as prayer. In virtually every study, prayer succeeds only as well as random chance. A 2006 meta-study concluded that prayer had no discernible effect, and a 2007 systemic review of intercessory prayer concluded that religious studies failed to produce significant findings. And this has been going on for decades. The first study of which I'm aware dates back to 1872, where Francis Galton found no correlation between prayers made for the British royal family and their health, well-being, or happiness. Double-blind studies invariably find that prayer gets you nowhere. Now, getting back to this argument, it's funny how they're looking only at the hits and ignoring the massive number of misses, isn't it? I mean, how many people are praying for food, people who are starving worldwide, and then they die of malnutrition? It's so silly that Christians have a saying that if God doesn't provide, then his answer to your prayer is no. Well, how do you tell the difference between a God that overwhelmingly doesn't answer prayers at all and says no a lot, and one that simply doesn't exist? I've got no idea, but this is one of the more absurd arguments I've seen. The argument from A Wonderful Life. Premise 1. Sometimes people who are lost in life find their way. Premise 2. These people could not have known the right way on their own. Premise 3. These people were shown the right way by something or someone other than themselves, from 2. Premise 4. There is no person showing them the way. Premise 5. God alone is a being who is not a person and who cares about each of us enough to show us the way. Premise 6. Only God could have helped these lost souls, from 4 and 5. Therefore, God exists. Sorry, but no. This is just stupid. It is filled with empty claims and absurd beliefs. And this is something that you will see among the religious a lot, so it's no surprise that it pops up in their apologetics all the time. People are pathetic and worthless. It's one of the core principles of most religious traditions. Therefore, without some imaginary man in the sky, man can never achieve anything, and if they ever do achieve anything, God has to be responsible. Says who? Why can't it be super powerful aliens? Why not those pesky, invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies? And even if it is a god, who says it's their god? Why does it have to be theirs? How do they know? They seem to be unable to propose any test to show that it was God, as opposed to, say, Zeus or Ra or Baal. So why are we supposed to take these unsupported claims at all seriously? This argument effectively follows the people are dumb model by saying that they can't possibly solve their own problems. They have to have a helping hand from an imaginary friend because otherwise we're too pathetic to do anything on our own. And of course, we see the leap of irrationality from 6 to 7 that appears in every single one of these arguments, because only God could have done this, therefore God exists. Says who? Well, blind faith, because that's all they've got. It's why these arguments don't impress anyone that isn't already a true believer. The argument from miracles. Premise 1. Miracles are events that violate the laws of nature. Premise 2. Miracles can be explained only by a force that has the power of suspending the laws of nature for the purpose of making its presence known or changing the course of human history from 1. Premise 3. Only God has the power and the purpose to carry out miracles from 2. Premise 4. We have a multitude of written and oral reports of miracles. Indeed, every major religion is founded on a list of miracles. Premise 5. Human testimony would be useless if it were not, in the majority of cases, veridical. Premise 6. The best explanation for why there are so many reports testifying to the same thing is that the reports are true from 5. Premise 7. The best explanation for the multitude of reports of miracles is that miracles have indeed occurred from 6. Therefore, God exists from 3 and 7. Okay, now show any miracles that have actually happened. Not things that we don't understand, things that actually violate the laws of nature. Not our understanding of the laws of nature, but the laws themselves. And that's exactly where the religious go entirely off the rails, because they obviously can't do that. At best, humans can only report that they saw something they can't explain. Unfortunately, they immediately try to explain it and claim that God did it. And I'm sorry, but you can't get from A to B in any credible way. Saying that you don't know what happened, then explaining what happened. Because unless you have some means of showing that you can discover the truth, not what you believe, but demonstrable, objectively verifiable truth, the claim is empty and no one ought to be impressed. Why anyone is, I will never understand. This is really just another argument from ignorance. I don't know, therefore God. But that isn't an actual explanation. It's a rationalization. Until they can prove miracles happen, and those miracles are a product of an actual God, much less their own personal God, this is just a complete waste of time. The argument from the hard problem of consciousness. Premise 1. The hard problem of consciousness consists in our difficulty in explaining why it subjectively feels like something to be a functioning brain. Premise 2. Consciousness is not a complex phenomena built out of simpler ones. It can consist of irreducible raw feels like seeing red or tasting salt. Premise 3. Science explains complex phenomena by reducing them to simpler ones and reducing them to still simpler ones until the simplest one is explained by the basic laws of physics. Premise 4. The basic laws of physics describe the properties of the elemental constituents of matter and energy, like quarks and quanta, which are not conscious. Premise 5. Science cannot derive consciousness by reducing it to basic physical laws about the elementary constituents of matter and energy from 2, 3, and 4. Premise 6. Science will never solve the hard problem of consciousness from 3 and 5. Premise 7. The explanation for consciousness must lie beyond physical laws from 6. Premise 8. Consciousness, lying outside of physical laws, must itself be immaterial from 7. Premise 9. God is immaterial for some reason that they just pulled out of their ass. Premise 10. Consciousness and God both partake in the same immaterial kind of being from 8 and 9. Premise 11. God has not only the means to impart consciousness to us, but also the motive, namely to allow us to enjoy a good life and to make it possible for our choices to cause or prevent suffering in others, therefore allowing for morality and meaning. That was long. Premise 12. Consciousness can only be explained by positing that God inserted a spark of the divine into us from 7, 10, and 11. Therefore, God exists. Alright, this whole argument rests on a very poor understanding of how science actually functions, which I guess is no surprise. In fact, if we look at premise 2, we see just how poor this understanding actually is. We don't actually see red. Our eyes perceive a particular wavelength of light, which our conscious mind identifies arbitrarily as red, based on the system of color names that people have invented for such things. If you don't even understand that, then complex philosophy is way beyond you. What irreducible complexity really means, whether they want to admit it or not, is they want to dumb complex ideas down to such a degree that even they can get it through their tiny little brains. And I'm sorry, but reality doesn't operate that way. And of course, when you get to premise 9, they're just back to defining God into existence, simply arbitrarily defining God's characteristics because it helps solve the problem. But how do they know that God is immaterial? How do they know anything about God? They don't. And premises 10 and 11 are just bald assertion, and 12 is so far off the reservation, it's ridiculous. I trust you see just how bad all of these arguments actually are, and how absurd the supposed reasoning behind them can be. The argument from the improbable self. Premise 1. I exist in all my particularity and contingency, not as a generic example of personhood, not as any old member of Homo sapiens, but as the unique conscious entity that I know as me. Premise 2. I can step outside myself and view my own contingent particularity with astonishment. Premise 3. This astonishment reveals that there must be something that accounts for why, out of all the particular things that I could have been, I am just this, namely me, from 1 and 2. Premise 4. Nothing within the world can account for why I am just this, since the laws of the world are generic. They can explain why certain kinds of things came to be, even, let's assume, why human beings with conscious brains came to be, but nothing in the world can explain why one of those human beings should be me. Premise 5. Only something outside the world who cares about me can therefore account for why I'm just this, from 4. Premise 6. God is the only thing outside the world who cares about each and every one of us. Therefore God exists. Alright, this is dumb. This is just dumb. Premise 1 is a personal subjective take on what is really an objective fact. What you know as you isn't what you really are. You are just any old member of Homo sapiens sapiens. You are not objectively special. You may want to believe that you are, but you're not. You are made of the same 3 billion base pairs of DNA as everyone else. You are not magical. This is just part of an argument from personal incredulity, where you want to accept an idea because it appeals to you on a personal level, or because the alternative is difficult to accept for personal emotional reasons. And I think you start to see why some of these arguments never get brought up by the religious, because many of them are just so idiotic on their face that any theist who trotted one of these out would get immediately laughed into oblivion. Because the argument from, I want to be special, isn't a good argument at all. It's an emotional problem. Why should we be impressed with that? The argument from survival after death. Premise 1. There is empirical evidence that people survive after death. Well, no, there isn't, but we'll come back to that. Patients who flatline during medical emergencies report an experience of floating over their bodies and seeing glimpses of a passage to another world, and can accurately report what happened around their bodies while they were dead to the world. Premise 2. A person's consciousness can survive after the death of his or her body from 1. Premise 3, survival after death entails the existence of an immaterial soul. Premise 4, the immaterial soul exists, from 2 and 3. Premise 5, if an immaterial soul exists, then God must exist. Therefore, God exists. All right, speaking of stupid arguments, this one is pretty hard to top. First off, as I said, premise 1 is simply false. While people who come close to death often come back with stories about things that they've seen, the reality is we understand exactly what's going on biologically, and it has nothing at all to do with the so-called other side. We know that loss of oxygen to the eye can cause tunnel vision. When the body starts to shut down, it releases huge amounts of steroids, epinephrine, and adrenaline, which explains feelings of euphoria and hallucinations. Your brain dumps memories in an attempt to make room for important new information coming in, and because our memory is tied so strongly to the fight or flight response, that's why whatever hallucinations happen are so vividly remembered. But because people have no real idea what's going on in their bodies, they invent fanciful notions and supernatural explanations for what are entirely physical and understandable events. And it all turns into yet another argument from ignorance. I don't get it, therefore God. But that's pretty much all of these idiotic arguments, isn't it? The argument from the inconceivability of personal annihilation. Premise 1. I cannot conceive of my own annihilation. As soon as I start to think about what it would be like not to exist, I am thinking, which implies that I would not be thinking about what it would be like not to exist. Premise 2. My annihilation is inconceivable, from 1. Premise 3. What cannot be conceived cannot be. Premise 4, I cannot be annihilated, from 2 and 3. Premise 5, I survive after my death, from 4. Therefore, God exists. Now, how God exists comes out of any of this, I don't know, but this is just your basic argument from ignorance. Here, we're back to the ever-popular argument of personal incredulity. I don't like the idea of ceasing to exist, thus it can't be real. But guess what? What you like or don't like doesn't mean a damn thing. Premise 3 is laughably absurd. People 200 years ago could never have conceived of computers, yet here we are using them every single day. So just because you cannot or do not want to believe something happens, that has no bearing on whether or not it actually does. This whole argument is dumb from beginning to end. The argument from moral truth. Premise 1. There exists objective moral truths, such as slavery and torture and genocide, are not just distasteful to us, but they are actually wrong. Premise 2. These objective moral truths are not grounded in the way the world is, but rather in the way that the world ought to be. Premise 3. The world itself, the way that it is, the laws of science that explain why it is that way, cannot account for the way that the world ought to be. Premise 4. The only way to account for morality is that God established morality, from 2 and 3, therefore God exists. Alright, premise 1 is just wrong. This is just argument by assertion. And it's funny that they brought up slavery, because just a couple of hundred years ago, not only was slavery seen as an objective moral good, it was Christianity that taught that it was. Moral views change over time. They change all the time. What we see as moral today will invariably be seen as horribly immoral in the future. And because premise 1 is so ridiculous, the rest falls apart. When you get to premise 3, which is a perfect example of Hume's is-ought problem, where Hume argued that far too many people look at what is, and then they try to extend that to what they think ought to be, which is philosophically and intellectually irrational, the further we go on, the more we see that these arguments are just fallacy stacked on fallacy stacked on fallacy, until you're playing musical chairs to see which fallacy is more fallacious than the next. I'm really not sure how these arguments convince anyone, Which, let's be honest, they don't, because they're not meant to convince the faithful. They're meant to comfort people who already believe by rationalizing their way to beliefs that these arguments would never convince anyone of. The argument from altruism. Premise 1. People often act altruistically, namely against their interests. They help others at a cost to themselves out of empathy, fairness, decency, and integrity. Premise 2. Natural selection can never favor true altruism because genes for selfishness will always outcompete genes for altruism. Recall that altruism, by definition, exacts a cost to the actor. Premise 3. Only a force acting outside of natural selection and intending for us to be moral could account for our ability to act altruistically from 2. Premise 4. God is the only force outside of natural selection that could intend for us to be moral. Premise 5. God must have implanted the moral instinct within us from 3 and 4. Therefore God exists. Again, I'm going to disagree with the very first premise because I don't think anyone acts entirely altruistically at all. They always get something out of it, even if it's just a dopamine hit to the brain or the belief that people will remember them as a hero. And premise 2 is wrong because evolution can and does reward sacrificial behavior, especially when they're doing it to protect their children, family, or tribe. Premise 3 is pulled right out of their theological ass, and this continues to premise 4, which is a bald assertion that cannot be rationally justified. You might as well say that Harry Potter is the only force outside of natural selection that could intend for us to be immoral. Why not? It's just as provable. And into the home stretch we go, with the expected argument from ignorance. I don't know, so God did it. Honestly, are we going to get anywhere near any kind of functional logic anytime soon? They have to do better than this. I mean, it's kind of hard to do any worse, isn't it? And finally, the argument from free will. Premise 1. Having free will means the freedom to choose our actions rather than their being determined by some prior cause. Premise 2. If we don't have free will, then we are not agents, for then we are not really acting, but rather we're being acted upon. That's why we don't punish people for involuntary actions, such as a teller who hands money to a bank robber at gunpoint, or a driver who injures a pedestrian after a defective tire blows out. Premise 3. To be a moral agent means to be held morally responsible for what one does. Premise 4. If we can't be held morally responsible for anything that we do, then the very idea of morality is meaningless. Premise 5. Morality is not meaningless. Premise 6. We have free will from 2 to 5. Premise 7. We, as moral agents, are not subject to the laws of nature, in particular, the neural events in a genetically and environmentally determined brain from 1 and 6. Premise 8. Only a being who is apart from the laws of nature and partake in the moral sphere could explain our being moral agents from 7. Premise 9. Only God is a being who is apart from the laws of nature and partakes of the moral sphere. Premise 10. Only God can explain our moral agency from 8 and 9. Therefore God exists. And yeah, because God's omniscience clearly destroys free will, because God, according to the religious at least, knows with perfect clarity everything that will ever happen, and God can never be wrong. And if that's true, then our actions cannot, by definition, be free, and this entire argument goes the way of the dodo. It has to, which is why the religious, when using this argument, do their damnedest to avoid talking about divine omniscience. Try getting into a debate with a theist on this, and they will run around in the most ridiculous circles to avoid dealing with that contradiction. The most popular argument I've seen is that God knows everything because God is timeless and has seen history from the end point of history, thus he knows what we will do, he didn't force us to do it. Except if we're incapable of doing something that God hasn't foreseen, then we have no free will by definition. We're just robots programmed by God or history or by whatever to do what we have to do with no real choice in the matter. Once that information is in our time, we are bound by it. All right, I know what happened in the Civil War because I've studied history. But if I went back in time to the Civil War and they had to do what I knew they would, then in that moment, they would have no free will. Absolutely not. So this just falls apart. And then we get back to a bunch of empty assertions as usual, none of which can be demonstrated to be reasonable and hence implode under the weight of their own stupidity. Does this convince anyone? I have no idea, but it shouldn't, because it's just philosophically empty. So that's the second set of 10 out of our list of bad apologetic arguments. Do you think they're getting any better, or are they getting worse? Have you seen a single one that stands up to any kind of rational scrutiny? Yeah, me either. These are really, really dumb arguments, made not to appeal to the skeptics because, like me, the skeptics will see right through them. No, they're intended to appeal to the already religious who just want to think that they have some good arguments, and it's somehow the non-religious who are the unreasonable ones in their demands for something better than this. But if this is the best they've got, then we're perfectly justified to laugh, shake our heads, and walk away. These arguments are just that bad, and I have a feeling they're going to keep going downhill before we see anything that a reasonable or rational person might consider seriously. So, what is the worst argument out of all of this set? Let me know in the comments. Or maybe the best, if anything really qualifies as best. Less worse? I don't know. Share with the class. Honestly, I don't think that any of these can be improved without gutting the entire God proposition. They are fundamentally flawed, and they can't be fixed. So let's see what the next 10 bring. Better? Worse? I guess it really doesn't matter. They're all just asinine rationalizations anyhow.